People always talk about the American dream like it's this big, shiny house with a white picket fence and a perfectly manicured lawn. But for me, the dream was always much smaller and a hell of a lot more rugged than that. It was about a patch of dirt up in the high Sierras, a place called Blackwood Basin, where the pines grow so thick they practically swallow the sunlight, and the air tastes like cold spring water and ancient sap, which is exactly where my old man built our family cabin back in '74. He didn't need oppos to use a contractor or a fancy design firm. He used his own two hands, a couple of heavy-duty saws, and a lot of sweat equity to raise those cedar logs. And that place wasn't oppos. Just a building to me. Nora's Landing, we called it. It was a fortress of memories, a sanctuary where the world couldn't and oppos reach us. At least, that's what I thought until the night the world didn't and oppos just reached me. It tried to kick my front door down with a pair of size 12 combat boots and enough flashing blue lights to trigger a seizure. I'd only been back at the basin for 6 days, trying to clear my head after a messy divorce and a corporate job that had drained the life out of me. And I was just starting to get used to the silence when the pounding started at 2 in the morning. I'm talking about the kind of heavy, rhythmic thudding that makes the dust shake off the rafters and sends your heart straight into your throat before you're even fully awake. I stumbled out of bed, grabbing an old iron fire poker, which looking back was probably overkill but felt necessary at the time, and I peeked through the heavy curtains only to see 2 county cruisers idling in my gravel drive, their headlights washing over the trees like twin spotlights. And standing right there in the middle of it all, looking like she'd just stepped off a country club veranda despite the hour, was Margaret Vance, the self-appointed high priestess of the Timberline Homeowners Association. Margaret was the kind of woman who wore her pearls like armor and carried a clipboard like a scepter, and the second I cracked the door, she didn't an oppos to even give me a chance to rub the sleep out of my eyes before she pointed a gloved finger at me and told the deputies that I was a squatter. And quote, "This man is unlawfully occupying a structure within the Timberline protected zone," end quote. She said, her voice sounding like a sharpened blade hidden in a velvet sheath, end quote. And as the president of the HOA, I am requesting his immediate removal for the safety and aesthetic integrity of our community, end quote. I just stood there barefoot on the porch boards that my father had planed himself, looking at this woman who I'd never seen a day in my life, and I felt this slow, hot burn of anger starting in my chest because she was an end oppos. Just trying to kick me out of my house. She was trying to tell me that my father's legacy was nothing more than an eyesore on her precious map. I looked at the older deputy, a guy who looked like he'd seen every kind of crazy the mountains had to offer, and I just shook my head while I went back inside for a second to grab the original deed, the one signed by the county surveyor back when Margaret was probably still in finishing school. I held that yellowed piece of paper up to the light, pointing to the boundary markers that clearly showed Nora's Landing was an end quote. Island end quote. Property, a historical carve-out that existed long before Timberline started building their cookie-cutter mansions across the ridge. I told them, end quote, "Officer, this land has been the Miller family for 50 years, and unless your friend here can show me a contract I signed with their little club, you're currently trespassing on private property," end quote. The deputies looked at each other, then at the deed, and then at Margaret, whose face turned a shade of red that I didn't and oppos think was biologically possible. But even as they backed down and told her there was nothing they could do, she didn't and oppos move. She stayed there in the dark, her eyes burning with a kind of cold, calculated fury, and I knew right then that this wasn't an oppos an administrative error. This was a land grab, and Margaret Vance didn't and oppos like being told an oppos, no, and oppos. The next few days were a psychological chess match that I wasn't and oppos prepared for, because Margaret didn't and oppos just want me gone. She wanted to break me down, so I'd sell the land for pennies on the dollar just to get away from her. She started with the end quote, environmental end quote, angle, which is always the favorite weapon of people who want to control what they don and oppos own. And I woke up on Tuesday to find a crew of guys in bright orange vests drilling into my private dock. They were installing this massive, ugly black silk curtain that stretched halfway across the cove, claiming it was a, end quote, mandatory runoff mitigation system, end quote. required by the HOA's new green initiative, and the kicker was that they'd bolted the whole thing directly into the heavy steel mooring ring my dad had set in concrete 40 years ago. I didn't oppose. TL, I didn't oppose. T-scream, I just walked into the shed and pulled out the old bolt cutters. The ones that still smelled like the oil my dad used to keep them from rusting, and I walked down to that dock with a calm that I think actually scared the workmen. One of them tried to step in my way, saying they had orders from the, end quote, community office, end quote, but I just looked him in the eye and said, end quote, this dock is private property, and that ring belongs to a man who's buried 3 miles from here. So if you don an oppose, do you want to explain to the sheriff why you're vandalizing my heritage? You'll step back? End quote. I clamped those cutters down and snapped the steel cable in one go, the sound echoing across the water like a gunshot, and, as the curtain slumped into the lake like a dead whale, I saw Margaret watching from her balcony across the cove through a pair of binoculars. That's when the end quote, surveillance, end quote, started, and if you've never had a high-end drone hovering 30 feet outside your bedroom window at 3 in the morning, let me tell you, it's a special kind of hell. They'd send these mechanical hornets out every night, the red and green lights blinking like some kind of alien invasion, and just when I'd finally drift off to sleep, they'd trigger these massive industrial floodlights they'd installed on the HOA's perimeter. Lights that weren't an oppose. T pointed at the path or the water, but directly into my cabin, turning my living room into a sterile, white interrogation chamber. It was harassment, plain and simple, a way to remind me that they were always watching, always there, waiting for me to crack. And for a minute, I almost did. I even had my old neighbor, Silas, come by, a guy who used to go elk hunting with my dad and someone I trusted since I was a kid. And he sat on my porch with this look of genuine pity on his face, telling me that Margaret was, in quote, connected, in quote, and that the HOA had lawyers on retainer who could drag this out until I was bankrupt and gray-haired. He slid a map across the table, an official-looking thing with a county seal, showing that the timberline boundaries had been, in quote, retroactively adjusted, in quote, during a closed-door session of the Planning Commission, and he whispered, in quote, Caleb, just take the settlement they're offering, boy. It's enough to buy a nice condo in the city, and you won't have to fight these people anymore. End quote. I looked at Silas. Then I looked at the map, and I realized that Margaret hadn't an oppose. T just bullied. The neighborhood, she'd bought it, and she was using the people I love to do her dirty work. But here's the thing about being raised by a man who built his own house. You learn how to look at the foundation before you trust the walls. I took that map into town and spent 3 days at the Hall of Records, digging through property tax filings, old survey notes, and environmental impact studies. And what I found wasn't an oppose. T just a mistake. It was a goddamn crime. I found out that Margaret's, in quote, environmental initiative, in quote, wasn't an oppose. T about the lake at all. It was a front to cover up the fact that the new Timberline clubhouse had been leaking gray water into the basin for 18 months, and they were trying to annex my land because the state-mandated filtration zone had to be located right where my cabin stood. If they could prove my property was, in quote, in violation, in quote, or, in quote, unoccupied, in quote, they could seize it through a legal loophole and fix their multi-million-dollar problem on my dime. So I decided to give Margaret the, in quote, aesthetic compliance, in quote, she was so worried about, but on my terms. I set up a series of high-definition trail cams and a mobile hotspot, and I started a 24/7 live stream titled, in quote, The Siege of Nora's Landing, in quote, and I didn't an oppose. T just filmed the drones and the floodlights. I filmed the water. I hired an independent lab to test the runoff coming from the HOA side of the lake, and the results were a nightmare. High levels of nitrogen and phosphates that were literally choking the life out of the cove, while Margaret was busy complaining about the color of my window shutters. I waited until the night of the annual, in quote, Basin Gala, in quote, a big-ticket fundraiser where all the local bigwigs and county commissioners were gathered at the Timberline Clubhouse to toast to their own success. I didn't an oppose. T crashed the party with a sign or a megaphone. I did it with a projector and a laptop. While Margaret was on stage, glowing in a silk dress, and talking about their commitment to, in quote, preserving the natural beauty of the Highlands, in quote, I tapped into their own outdoor theater system, the one they use for movie nights on the lawn, and I overrode the feed. Suddenly, instead of her, in quote, heritage video, in quote, The 50-foot screen was filled with the footage of her drones harassing me, the shots of the leaking gray water pipes behind the clubhouse, and the forged maps I'd found in the records office. But the real kicker, the thing that finally broke the glass, was the audio recording I'd captured of her and Silas on my porch, where she'd clearly stated that she didn't oppose care about the lake. She just needed, in quote, that eyesore of a cabin, in quote, gone to satisfy the state inspectors. The silence that fell over that crowd was the loudest thing I've ever heard, a heavy, suffocating quiet as 100 wealthy donors realized they'd been funding a fraud, and Margaret just stood there at the podium, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, while the county sheriff, who happened to be an invited guest, walked slowly toward the stage. The aftermath was a whirlwind of subpoenas, environmental lawsuits, and a complete collapse of the Timberline Board. And while Margaret managed to avoid jail time through some fancy legal footwork, she was forced to resign in disgrace and move out of the basin entirely. Silas eventually came back to apologize, but some bridges are burned too deep for a simple, in quote, sorry, in quote, to fix the charring, and I realized that sometimes the people you think are your anchors are the ones trying to sink the boat. Now, Blackwood Basin is quiet again, but it's a different kind of quiet, a real peace that feels earned. I still sit on the porch every night, watching the stars reflect in the water that's finally starting to clear up, and I think about my dad and how he'd probably just laugh at the whole thing, telling me I should have used a bigger fire poker. The cabin is still there, weathered in gray and perfectly out of compliance with everything Margaret Vance ever stood for, and that's exactly how it's going to stay. But it makes me wonder about all the other, in quote, islands, in quote, out there, the people who are being pushed out of their own history by some HOA president with a clipboard and a god complex. Is a, in quote, beautiful, in quote, community worth the price of its soul? Or are we so obsessed with property values that we've forgotten what it actually means to be a neighbor? I stood my ground and I won, but a lot of people don into oppose, to have the deed in their hand or the fire in their belly to fight back. So, tell me, if it was your family's legacy on the line, how far would you go to protect a few old logs and a piece of dirt? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it, because I have a feeling Margaret Vance ISN and oppose. The only one out there trying to redraw the map.